civil injury, but civil religion. Moral injury is the betrayal by others of what is right. I've been studying the experiences of soldiers, and it seems to me, I've seen in the literature that the concept of moral injury is it's going everywhere. Doctors and nurses in hospitals talking about how they suffer moral injury, others suffering moral injury, the people who found themselves the victims of Wells Fargo Bank certainly suffered moral injury. So it's an issue that I think you'll all be hearing about in the future. The key person who defined the concept said that post-traumatic stress disorder is really not sufficient, right? It looks at people through a psychological lens as individuals, and what's really needed is to look at how their larger moral world is undone, right? So the canopy of meaning is destroyed. So I thought I'd take I found this in What and Whom Do We Trust? I found this really interesting, right? What do I trust? Oh, let's see, that's a really strange question. Do I trust government? No. A friend of mine in Washington, who was a well-known journalist and writer, wrote a book called All Governments Lie, right? And it was really the story of, that was the slogan of a campaigning journalist named I.F. Stone, who always used this as his mantra. So I don't, and we see it. Most recently, I don't know if you pay attention to this kind of stuff, but I do. The wars in Afghanistan and Iraq that the United States government has been prosecuting, they lied again, once more, just like they did during the Vietnam War. And Hannah Arendt has a great discussion of that and said, how could they? But they did. Only a few million people killed, right? Not a big deal in their minds. The other thing that I want to talk about in this regard, do I trust economic institutions? Well, one of the things that's happening, and this pervades other institutions as well, is Edward Said, the Palestinian-American critic, in his book, Culture and Imperialism, towards the end of the book he talks about the relentless commodification of everything, right? He said, to think about the future, that's what we need to do. And it's tied, for me, to advertising, right? A close friend of mine of many years was once up for the Federal Trade Commission in the United States as chief legal counsel. He didn't want the job, so he started his interview with the people that were making the decisions and said, to begin with, we need to recognize that all advertising is false and misleading, right? Classic example, of course, is what happened to get women to smoke cigarettes in the 1920s. The chief person considered the father of public relations, was a man named Edward Bernays. Edward Bernays was approached by the tobacco companies who realized they were missing half the market, and they wanted to get women to smoke cigarettes, right? So what did they do? Bernays got, by the standards of the time, very attractive women, debutantes, I'm told, who marched in the Easter Parade in New York City, right? Thousands of people there, photographers, journalists, etc. And at a certain predetermined moment, the women all lit up cigarettes. Now, in those days, in the late 1920s, if women smoked cigarettes, well, they were of questionable moral character, shall we say, right? So the women lit up the cigarettes at a predetermined moment, and of course all the photographers started taking photographs, etc. And when they were asked what they were doing, they said, these are torches of freedom. It was a women's liberation issue, right? Women had gotten the right to vote, now they had the right to smoke in public. Okay, so of course, They weren't really torches of freedom. They were torches of cancer, but that's another story, right? But that's the way commodification works. It doesn't mean that it should be in any way honest, right? And if you look at politics, one of the things I don't trust is what's called democracy. Democracy in most of our states is really just a simulation of a democracy, right? And you see it in a number of different areas. People will always be citing opinion polls. A colleague of mine, when I was working at the Center on War, Peace, and the News Media at New York University, was very good about this. He wrote a very interesting article saying, you know, it doesn't matter what people's opinions are. The question is, what do people know, right? Because most of the time, they don't know what they have an opinion about. If you're asked what your opinion is and you don't know it by some stranger who seems authoritative, what do? You say, well, I believe blah, 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 right? And that's part of the problem for democracy today. But even worse, in my opinion, is the fact that everything becomes commodified. So the candidates themselves. I worked for 2 years as a special assistant to a United States Senator who became the model for the film The Candidate, starring Robert Redford in 1970, believe it or not. And Redford's, the entire film was built around the notion that John Tunney, the senator, in this case played by Robert Redford, was a complete construction, right? There was no substance there. It was he was meant to be sold to the people who might vote for him, right? And in fact, he won election in 1970, and several years later I worked for him. And it was very interesting to me. Even I learned a very important lesson in contemporary politics. And that is, I used to have to write letters for the senator that would go out under his signature, right? Somebody wrote him about something, you know, and he would respond, right? I would write the letter, right? Okay. What did I learn to do? I learned to write letters that seemed to say something but said nothing, basically. There was no way we were going to commit to anything. Oh, thank you very much for sending your sending me the letter with concern about the B-1 bomber, right? You know, how many letters did we have to get a month at that time? We had, this is before computers, remember? The senator got about 60,000 letters a month. You can imagine what it's like today. So it's all computerized, and the letters are all standardized. No one actually says anything, right? And of course, you get more and more fake news, right? Because in fact, you know, none of it is real in any deep sense of the term. I would also say that one of the people I knew very well was in California, was running for the US Congress, and I've told this anecdote to a few people here, but it's really worth considering. We met one day, and we went to have a drink by the beach in San Diego, which was lovely, but I said, well, how's it going, you know, the campaign? And she said, the biggest difficulty I have is getting my own words into my own speeches. And I said, what? Yeah, she said, in many ways, my staff would prefer it if I didn't exist, so that they could make the ultimate commodity, right? And that's what happens to all of them. I was seduced enough to run for political office myself, and I did these lovely pictures. I still have them in campaign literature. My little daughter on my shoulders, walking along like I was John Kennedy or some person like that, you know, and all that stuff is crap. It's really junk, right? It has no substance. And we need to recognize that, because that's what goes on in the entire economic and political realm. So, do I trust economic institutions? Look at this guy, these guys up here. What they did was they created fake accounts for hundreds, thousands of their customers, right? It was an incredible scam, and then they charged them service fees and all sorts of things for all of this. They have made an agreement, the company has made an agreement to pay $3 billion to resolve the probes. But no one, I might note, is going to jail. But of course, if you stuck up somebody with a gun and took $100 from them on the street in Los Angeles, there'd be no question, right? Especially if you were a person of color, right? But in this case, the white folks just, they manipulated a few things, and, so there is the game, quite exposed, it seems to me. And if you start looking at government in relation to corporations, do I trust corporations? Oh, give me a break, right? I mean, not only would I not want to deal with these guys, but, I'm sure some of you who followed the story of Boeing and its 737 MAX, right? What's really nice is the way in which the federal government allowed them to self-certify their safety standards. Oh yeah, we'll just sign off on it. That's exactly what happened. And that's exactly what happens with lots and lots of corporations. I would make the arguments that in terms of the governance, or lack of governance, if you will, of our lives, corporations make the decisions. Governments don't, right? And what's further is, do I trust academic institutions? Well, a bit. But, I would say, I'll give you an example. I was at my alma mater where I did my doctorate in 2015. In the 1970s, when I was working on my doctorate in the late 70s, early 80s, it was really, you didn't have business schools. They were considered not academically, of any value, right? So in 2015, I was having a chat with a friend of mine who's been here, Richard Madsen, who wrote a book with a couple of other people called Good Society and Habits of the Heart, etc. And he was showing me around the campus, and by this time, 2015, the biggest building on the campus was the business school, right? And what was interesting to me is a couple of years later, there was a book out about how many, there's now 12,000 or so business schools around the world. And I sent him a note about this. He said, well, right now, the entire university is a business school. And the business school at the University of California, San Diego has an entire wing, an entire building called Wells Fargo Hall. And I don't think they study corporate corruption, right? How to make more money, right? And the thing to realize about all this is that this is exactly at the root of both the economies that we live within and also the detritus, shall we say, to be polite, that they produce. So shortly after World War II, they were figuring out how to ramp up the US economy. An economic analyst named Victor Lebeau articulated the solution that has become the norm for the whole system. He said, quote, "Our enormously productive economy demands that we make consumption our way of life. That we convert the buying and use of goods into rituals. That we seek our spiritual satisfaction, our ego satisfaction in consumption. We need things consumed, burned up, replaced, and discarded at an ever-accelerating rate." And the chairman of the Economic Advisory Committee to President Eisenhower in the 1950s said, "The American economy's ultimate purpose is to produce more consumer goods," right? We wonder why the natural world is polluted. So one of the things they do is planned obsolescence. Every one of us here in this room, I would get money, has had to get a new phone or get a new whatever, new computer, right? I've got old phones that I wish I could still use. I had a landline once. Remember what those were? Amazing. And why do we need these other things? Oh, well, lots of reasons, including the wonderful advertisements you get every day. If I was to, I'll end this here, Jody. Do I trust other people? One of the questions I ask when I meet somebody, I ask in my own head, I don't say it. I say, have you turned yourself into a commodity? Right? Some people here know the story of my, I was married right out of university, 2 to 3 years. We were just kids. And several years later, after we'd split up, there was all sorts of, tempestuous times in the late 60s, early 70s. I was in the south of France with a friend of mine, and for some reason, I was not particularly interested, to say the truth, I was not particularly interested in these men's magazines, but there was a magazine called Louis, him. And I get these intuitions every now and then, these sort of intuitions. I picked up this magazine when I was going up to get us a refill of whatever we were drinking. And I opened it up, and there she was. She said her name was Juliette, and she was Parisienne, and the daughter of a diplomat. And she was Miss March, I think it was. Her name was Anne, actually, and she was the daughter of a plumber from Minnesota in the American Midwest, right? What's that about? It's about that relentless commodification game, right? I mean, it might have worked better if she'd been in a biker's magazine or something, if she was the daughter of a plumber from Minnesota. So I'll say finally, the one thing I think we need to do is to rebuild real communities. I've heard, Alexander, your talk as well this morning. I don't think we can artificially produce them. I think we have to stop what's going on first, and I think we have to challenge it. One of the things I would suggest you do is take a look at the works of Ayn Rand. If you don't know who Ayn Rand is, find out, right? My favorite book in Ayn Rand's, one of her novels called Atlas Shrugged, right? Yeah. Atlas Shrugged is only outsold by one other book every year, the Bible. So somebody treats it at the level of the Bible. But this book, on the virtue of selfishness, will give you an idea of what's really happening with our economies and why there are 2,000 people who are classified as billionaires, while 50,000 people are homeless on the streets of Los Angeles. Thanks very much.